I now invite Dr. Peter again for his second talk.
So we have an advertising campaign in the United States that goes, the few, the proud, the Marines. So I think you're the Marines, the ones who are left here for the third talk. I know that. So thank you for your attendance and your perseverance. And it's hard to listen to a lot of talks in a row. I know how that goes. I don't know how many members of the choir are still here, the choir that sang at the Mass this morning, but I wanted to thank them for singing all that beautiful William Byrd, but also for singing Mass 12. That was the chant. The chant setting was called Mass number 12. And why do I thank you for Mass number 12? Because that was the chant Mass that was sung at my wedding that Father Ashley presided over 27 years ago, almost 27 years ago. So I like Mass 12. I mean, I've sung it many times since then, but I can't really sing it without thinking about the wedding Mass that we picked that particular Mass for. So in order to address sacred music, we first have to speak about music. Most of the mistakes people make when it comes to music for the liturgy stem from their lack of understanding of the art of music itself, and why it's important to exercise discernment in its regard. The first part of my talk will, therefore, be about good music versus bad, or we could say more modestly, better versus worse music. The second part will then turn to the kinds of music suitable and unsuitable for the Holy Mass. What is the one thing, and perhaps the only thing, that Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, Chrysostom, Aquinas, Nietzsche, Wagner, Schopenhauer, Josef Pieper, and Joseph Ratzinger all agree on 100%? They agree that music penetrates into the soul of man, stirring and shaping his inner life, and thereby affecting his perception of and engagement with reality as a whole. Music works from within, pulling one's character to itself, and shaping the soul until one feels pleasure only in its embrace and sharp pain in being severed from it. A friend of the great cellist Jacqueline Dupre once said, "Music never lies." How true this is. People can lie, the lyrics of songs can lie, but the music itself can never lie. In a mysterious way that will always baffle analysis, music contains and conveys a certain spirit, embodied in its rhythms, melodies, and harmonies. We cannot translate this spirit into a sequence of descriptive words. Music is not just a vaguer form of poetry, but speaks its own ineffable language, by which cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. Every piece of music bears a message that it makes present, transmits to the listener, plants within him. Music does not speak of things, but tells of weal and woe. Those are the words of Josef Pieper. It is capable of communicating the giving and receiving of love, trials and pains, intimacy and majesty, nostalgia for what has been, hope against hope for what might still be. In its highest forms, it can point to a grandeur not of this world, more real than this world, glimpsed like a sliver of sun through the clouds, drawing us on and dispelling our despair. It is also possible for music to evoke rage, anxiety, lasciviousness, despair. Is it not something of a miracle that music, even without words, can speak of all this? A wordless language that in some ways is more eloquent than any words. The philosopher Roger Scruton observes, you can see I like Roger Scruton, quote, "Nobody who understands the experience of melody, harmony, and rhythm will doubt their value. Not only are they, in their traditional forms, the distillation of centuries of social life, they are also forms of knowledge, providing the competence to reach out of ourselves through music. Through melody, harmony, and rhythm, we enter a world where others exist beside the self, a world that is full of feeling, but also ordered, disciplined, but free. That is why music is a character-forming force, and the decline of musical taste is a decline in morals." Unquote. The inescapable reality is that we internalize the music we sing or listen to. It becomes a part of us. It shapes us in its image. Sometimes people hastily dismiss the idea that the music they listen to forms their moral character, that is, how they perceive what is good for themselves and how they should live. But this is impossible for any observant person to deny. A friend of mine explained it this way, quote, "Extremes in music create recognizable populations. Heavy metal fans tend to dress and walk alike and are often pale and thin. Huge belt buckles and hats pick out the serious country music buffs. Rap consumers fit a stereotype, and on it goes. Along with the visible similarities go internal resemblances. Heavy metal folks are brooding and angry. Rap people are bouncy but irascible. Country music people are cheerful and loyal, and so on. Few things in life create visible populations the way music does. Drugs do, jobs can, religious vocations do. Sports don't, foods don't. You can't pick out baseball fans from hockey fans in a crowd, or lovers of Italian cuisine as opposed to French cooking. I mean, that is just in a normal crowd like the city streets. Living in a certain region can produce a certain look, but the effects of music will override regional differences. The fact that extremes in music create visible populations of people who morally resemble one another indicates that less extreme musical forms, such as light jazz, pop, classical music, and so on, are also forming populations in less visible ways. After all, if factor X produces an extreme difference when applied heavily, wouldn't factor X produce some difference if applied more lightly? If extreme musical forms like heavy metal produce extreme visible and moral differences, then wouldn't jazz or Baroque music produce real but less extreme moral differences in men? Certainly, the hypothesis that music is morally indifferent doesn't predict the observed results of the extremes. In fact, the observed facts say that music is a powerful moral force. It is used in ecstatic cults for a reason." Unquote. As Roger Scruton says pithily, "To withhold all judgment as though taste in music were on a par with a taste in ice cream is precisely not to understand the power of music. Put simply, music expresses and reinforces a chosen identity, chosen either by the listener himself or pre-chosen by a tradition into which the listener is inserted by his parents, his teachers, his pastors. You are what you listen to and look at far more than you are what you eat. What we take in through our senses is the food and drink of our souls. And we will be mentally and spiritually healthy or unhealthy depending on the quality of that food and drink. Your eyes and ears are the mouth of your soul. You have to think about this. Your eyes and ears are the mouth of your soul. If our music is that of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, of peace, of beauty, we will be eating and drinking the Spirit of truth, the love of the Father and the Son. If our music is that of the world or the prince of this world, we will be eating and drinking the spirit of worldliness. We cannot be too careful about this musical dietary discernment. In the letter of St. James we read, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." That's James 4:4. St. Paul gives us our resounding marching orders when he declares to the Romans, "I appeal to you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. That's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. Art and ethics are to some extent distinct from each other. A virtuous man will not necessarily produce good art, and a vicious man will not necessarily produce bad art. The former, the virtuous man, may give us sentimental kitsch, and the latter might give us a masterpiece, like Caravaggio. However, over time, and in ways both subtle and obvious, moral evils and intellectual evils, I mean vices and errors, will damage or destroy the soundness of the art that emerges from a soul infected by them. Hence, we should be vigilant, even scrupulous, about the influences we allow into our souls. This has always been true and will always be true. No matter how different modern man may appear to be, he still has a mind to nourish, a heart to shape, and a soul to save. And the soul will be saved through the same virtues, the same harmony of faith and reason and passions as that of pre-modern man, post-modern man, and any other type of man there may ever be. As rational animals, and even more as Christians who worship the crucified and risen Logos, the incarnate Word of God, we ought to nourish our souls to the extent possible on the best of the fine arts, giving less room to what is mediocre or shallow, and none at all to what is base. As St. Paul says to the Philippians, "Brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." That's Philippians 4:8. We are called to pursue excellence in all aspects of life, including our leisure and recreational activities. St. Paul writes to St. Titus, "The grace of God has appeared for the salvation of all men, training us to renounce irreligion and worldly passions and to live sober, upright, and godly lives in this world." Titus 2, verses 11 to 12. Indeed, our rational human nature and the grace of God drive us toward perfection. We ought, therefore, to be concerned about our culture's descent into mediocrity, banality, sensuality, ugliness, and violence. This slide threatens to destroy high culture as well as authentic folk culture, both of which are beautiful in their own ways. We should not be relativists or subjectivists about artistic truth any more than we are about the objective reality of human nature and the natural law. Anyone who is consistent will see that the beautiful, like its companions, the good and the true, is not reducible to subjective whim, but is based on objective criteria that already point towards the divine. Palestrina and Bach are great not because they just happen to cough up nice music as if by an irrational spasm, but because their minds and hearts were beautifully attuned to the microcosmic and macrocosmic principles of melody, harmony, and rhythm. A lot of different styles of beautiful music can emerge from these principles, but the principles themselves are real and not created by man. They are discovered, internalized, and brought to fruition in works of art. But so far I am painting with a broad brush. Can we be more specific about what's wrong with certain kinds of music and what's good about more artistically refined music? Rhythm is the most basic element of music, the most primitive. This is why the music of some primitive cultures consists mostly of drumming. You can't have music without rhythm. That's the first ingredient. More advanced cultures, presupposing the framework of rhythm, develop beautiful melodies above it. The most advanced cultures, presupposing both rhythm and melody, develop a system of harmony. When you listen to a piece by, for example, William Byrd, Antonio Vivaldi, Mozart, or Tchaikovsky, the rhythm, although discernible, is subordinated to the melody and harmony, which takes center stage. Rock, rap, metal, pop, trance, and other such popular styles invert this rational hierarchy of rhythm, melody, and harmony. Such styles accentuate the beat strip the harmonic framework to a bare minimum, and employ repetitious, unlyrical melodies, if they could even be called that, in order to stimulate the concupiscible and irascible sense appetites in a disordered manner. In everyday language, that means the music is designed to overstimulate passions like desire for sense pleasure and anger or rage at real or perceived threats to ourselves. We are dealing here with music deliberately primitive, passionate, and sensual. It is one thing for such music to proceed from barely literate savages who don't know any better, but it is quite another for it to proceed from the descendants of a rich folk culture and a resplendent high culture. In this case, in our case, it amounts to a rejection of one's own providential inheritance. We are the beneficiaries of over 1,000 years of glorious Western music, a heritage that has no parallel in any other civilization that has ever existed. Each one of us, as a rational animal, as a citizen of the West, and as a Christian, should take hold of it, this inheritance, and take advantage of it. As I said before, we should be striving for excellence, not only spiritual and moral, but also intellectual and artistic excellence. A steady diet of rock, heavy metal, rap, or pop, or any of these styles, carries with it the serious risk of stunting or warping one's moral growth, narrowing one's intellectual horizons, and impeding or clouding one's spiritual life. In a world of commercialized propaganda in favor of hedonism, materialism, and relativism, we need to be very careful about the message we are taking in. Am I saying that popular music always has to be bad? That the only good music there is that of a cultural elite? Are all of us supposed to become snobs? No, not at all. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to develop some cultural sophistication. After all, it's a perfection of our rational nature as made in the image and likeness of God. Yet, the point is not sophistication for its own sake. That would be snobbery. The point is to develop an ear for what is beautiful and fitting for every occasion, with all the diversity that occasions call for. Thus, when sitting around a campfire, one should sing folk songs. At a square dance, one should have good old-fashioned square dance music. At a wedding reception, one might showcase waltzes, swings, and country dances. I've been to many weddings where the selection of music at the reception is tasteful and where real dances are done by adventurous young people. Allow me to digress for a moment about dancing. The rarity of the use of triple time, so the 3/4 signature, if you want to put it in those terms, in pop music bespeaks a loss of the art of dance. Dances in triple time, the waltz being the most famous, but there are many others too, are notable for their lilting, gentle, noble, or debonair attitude. If ever there was a manifest sign of cultural degeneration, it would have to be the descent from minuet to waltz to swing to disco to deafening nightclub mixes of throbbing monotony, where people dance, quote unquote, by pulsating and gyrating in an aerobic type exercise of random individuals. With each step in the descent, we see a lessening of the social and communal dimension of dance, which is supposed to be an imitation of the orderly cosmos and of the complementary relationship of the sexes within it. With each step down, we see a decrease of formal beauty, a lapse of dignity, a loosening of morals, and a growing contempt for order, symmetry, and coordination of partners. Every normal human occupation has well-crafted music that suits it. Let me be clear, if I haven't already been. Popular music does not have to be bad. The popular music of a healthy age, like the Catholic Middle Ages with its pilgrim songs and troubadour ballads, is beautiful through and through. Music to be good does not have to be boring and straight-laced or super refined and subtle. Medieval music displays immediacy, spontaneity, innocence. Its inventive melodies, harmonic ingenuity, and rhythmic drive are compelling and captivating. All you have to do is look up the Livre de Vermel online. It's this incredible book of medieval music that is just captivating. There's nothing like it. Much the same could be said about any kind of genuine folk music, which happily has experienced a tremendous revival in recent decades. You could think of bluegrass or Celtic and Scottish music. You may find it surprising that so far I have spent relatively little time talking about lyrics. For many conservative critics, the lyrics are the only thing or the main thing they object to. But if there is anything I want to impress on you today, it would be that we must give full acknowledgement to the greater power exercised by the music itself. A so-called Christian heavy metal band would still harm its listeners' souls by the style of music, even if they took their lyrics straight from the Bible. That being said, it is no small problem that vast swaths of today's music is plagued with bad lyrics. Sometimes these lyrics are just plain repulsive, vulgar, obscene, violent, satanic, etc. There can never be an excuse for listening to pieces with lyrics of this sort, no matter what the music may be like. And I would say that if you want to know whether the lyrics are suitable, you should try in your imagination, you should imagine what it would be like to go in front of your parents and recite the lyrics to them and explain what the lyrics mean. If you'd be embarrassed to do that, then you shouldn't be listening to the piece. However, the deeper issue, I would say, is the dearth of worthwhile poetry. Music lovers protest bitterly when I attack the lyrics of their favorite genres. But if you just read the words out loud, like a poem, you can hardly keep from cringing or laughing at lyrics that rarely rise above pubescent preoccupations, conveyed in high school vocabulary that barely rhymes and almost never respects meter. In short, crummy poetry. Not even worth a Hallmark card. Catholics, above all, should have no difficulty admitting that there are objective standards in the arts, that poetry, like any other art, has its rules and ideals, and that we should care enough to seek out good poetry in music, since we will be giving it a permanent place in our souls. That is, you will never forget the lyrics that you listen to, so you might as well put good lyrics into your soul rather than bad ones. The difference between rock, pop, or rap lyrics on the one hand and medieval popular songs or European lyric poetry on the other hand is starker than the difference between night and day. In its diction or word choice, use of metaphor, meter, and rhyme, and conceptual content, the poetry set to music by the great composers is on a level as far above that of today's popular music as the heavens above the earth, or the earth above the underworld. When you listen to Victoria setting to music the lamentations of the prophet Jeremiah, Haydn setting the poet Milton, Schubert setting Goethe, or Vaughan Williams setting George Herbert, then you discover what great poetry united to great music sounds like. If all that I've been saying so far is true, even if it's largely true, or probably true, it follows that the music and lyrics we use in Catholic liturgy are of the utmost importance in outwardly expressing to one another and inwardly impressing upon ourselves what we think we are doing and the meaning it has for us, how it will shape us as worshipers in spirit and in truth, or the opposite. Whenever the popes of modern times speak about sacred, that is, liturgical music, I am referring here above all to Pius X and Pius XII, though Pius XI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI have made notable contributions as well. The first quality they put forward is holiness or sanctity, which they describe as worthiness of or suitability for the celebration of the sacred mysteries of Christ, as well as a lack of worldliness or even that which is suggestive of the secular domain. The fathers of the Council of Trent frowned upon the use of secular melodies even when transformed into the style of sacred music, and Pius X fought valiantly against the influence of Italian opera. That is, the influence of the opera in church music. It was not that such music was not good as far as the rules of composition were concerned. Sometimes it was artistically excellent. Rather, the problem was that the music carried strong associations with celebrating the goods of this life and not the heavenly goods of the life to come. If the musical style is carried over from the outside world and brought straight into the temple, it profanes the liturgy and harms the spiritual progress of the faithful. Liturgical music should not only be, but also seem to be, exclusively connected with and consecrated to the church's liturgy. It is not enough for a type of music to have been intended for the sake of performance in a church. It is crucial that it be felt or experienced as associated with divine worship. To some extent, this will be a matter of cultural conditioning. Some people will know more about liturgy and its panoply of fine arts than others. But as followers of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word who extends his real presence through space and time, we acknowledge as a principle of faith that there are hallowed traditions of prayer, ceremonial, and music, slowly matured over many centuries, that practically cry out Catholicism, signs that identify us and bind us to each other and to our Lord. And these would be things like the kind of vestments we use and the incense and the ad orientem and the music and so forth. These are all signs that cry out Catholicism. Over the course of more than 3 decades of experience singing in a variety of churches and settings, I have been astonished by the way in which Catholics, even relatively unchurched or uncatechized ones, immediately recognize Gregorian chant as distinctively Catholic, and more often than not, appreciate some presence of it in the liturgy. Even Hollywood movie directors know that much. Whenever they want to evoke a Catholic atmosphere, they make sure there's chant wafting in the background. It's not, Marty Haugen. Perhaps in this case only, the clergy would be right to take their bearings from the secular world's business sense. The reason Gregorian chant is held up as the supreme model of sacred music and the normative music of the Roman Rite is not far to seek. It is music that grew up together with the liturgy, fraternal twins from the cradle, as intimately united as soul and body. This, in fact, is why the Second Vatican Council, in the Constitution on the Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, elevated chant above all other forms of music and urged the careful adherence to tradition on this very point. Now, this text that I'm about to read to you has been alluded to and partially quoted several times today, but I'll give you the whole paragraph now. The musical tradition of the Universal Church is a treasure of inestimable value, greater even than that of any other art. And I just want to pause for a moment. That's a remarkable statement. That's saying the sacred music of the Church's tradition is worth more, it's more valuable than St. Peter's Basilica, than any church architecture, Notre Dame, Chartres, any church architecture, any vestments, anything else. The music is more important than all of those arts. That's an amazing statement. The main reason for this preeminence is that as sacred chant united to the words, it forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy. Accordingly, the Sacred Council, keeping to the norms and precepts of ecclesiastical tradition and discipline, that's not language that most people associate with Vatican II, and having regard to the purpose of sacred music, which is the glory of God and the sanctification of the faithful, decrees as follows. Liturgical worship is given a more noble form when the divine offices are celebrated solemnly in chant. The treasure of sacred music, I'm skipping around a little bit here. The treasure of sacred music is to be preserved and fostered with great care. Choirs must be diligently promoted. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to, or characteristically belonging to, the Roman liturgy, with the result that, other things being equal, in liturgical services it should hold the foremost place. Unquote. That's all from Vatican II. It is probably accurate to say that no other passage from the last council has been more systematically ignored and ruthlessly contradicted than this one. Chant is the musical home of the words of divine worship, the servant of its actions. Its exclusive function is to clothe in music God's holy words to us and our words to him and about him. It has no other realm or purpose. When we hear chant, there is no ambiguity or ambivalence about what it is or what it is for. It breathes the spirit of the liturgy and cannot be mistaken for secular music in any way. Its 8 characteristics, at least this is my counting of its characteristics: primacy of the word, free, that is non-metrical singing, unaccompanied vocalization, anonymity, emotional moderation, and unambiguous sacrality. show that Gregorian chant is not just a little bit different from other types of music, but profoundly different, both beautiful and strange, as God himself is. Something similar is true about polyphonic singing and the use of the pipe organ, which, after many centuries of nearly exclusive use in churches, are so completely bound up with the ecclesiastical sphere that their sound equates with church or religion in the ears of most people. The long line of popes who have taught on sacred music maintain that these strong and deep cultural associations are good and important. It follows that music with a double identity, music that is ambiguous in purpose and morality, is deeply problematic for the church. Many contemporary church songs, especially in the so-called praise and worship genre, are nothing other than religiously themed pop songs, as one can see by examining the chord sequences, the shape of the melodies, the particular use of syncopation, the style of the singing with which it is marketed, and the ease with which percussion could be added or has been added. We can develop this critique if we look at the three criteria enunciated by Pope Pius X and expounded by Pius XII: holiness or sanctity, goodness of form or artistic soundness, and universality, which one might also think of as Catholicity. As for the first quality, holiness or sanctity, sacred music is not to have any reminiscences of purely secular music, either in itself or in the manner in which it is performed. Consider this thought experiment. Play a random sampling of contemporary American church music, or North American, or just about anywhere in the Western world, for someone who does not speak English, and ask, in his own language of course, what he thinks the songs are all about. He might reasonably assume that they were secular love songs. A different way of running the same experiment: take the same piece of church music, substitute lyrics about falling in love or world peace, and see if the words are incongruous with the musical style. In contrast, think of the absurdity of singing such worldly lyrics to the music of a Gregorian chant. It would be hilarious because it would be so ridiculous. Or putting those words to Palestrina's Sicut Cervus, or a chorale by Johann Sebastian Bach, or Duraflé's Ubi Caritas. So you take any of these great sacred pieces and try to put secular words in and see how ridiculous the effect is. Moreover, the instrumentation and technique used for praise and worship, with strummed guitars and or piano and even percussion, strongly conveys the atmosphere of secular music, since these instruments originated in and are still associated with a variety of styles that have in common their extra-ecclesiastical nature, either the romantic concert hall repertoire, or jazz, or early rock, country, and pop-influenced folk. The style of popular Christian singing is one of its biggest problems. The voice slides from pitch to pitch with the scooping and warbling that derive from jazz and pop styles. In its origins, this manner of singing was intended to be a more passionate, realistic style, as opposed to the highly trained and therefore artificial voices of operatic singers. But it is no less opposed to the pure tone and lucid harmony aimed at in polyphonic ensembles, and the tranquil unanimity aimed at in unison chanting, both of which symbolize the unity and Catholicity of the Church. As to the second quality, artistic goodness, sacred music should be resplendent for its formal integrity, radiating grandeur, majesty, dignity, loftiness, and transcendence, as the liturgy should do in all respects. Songs in the praise and worship genre are lacking or weak in those attributes just mentioned, being characterized instead by simple, not to say simplistic, melodies and harmonies, and expressing a narrow emotional range. Such songs do not express or evoke their divine object or the human person's spiritual nature with appropriate musical means. The regular metrical beat and the predictable sentimental melodies suggest a confinement to earthliness and the comfort of familiarity, as opposed to the free-floating word-based rhythms and the soaring, at times capricious modal melodies of traditional chanting and polyphony, which so well evoke the eternity, infinity, and strangeness of the divine. If someone were to object that the Holy Eucharist is a humble sacrament, given under the signs of simple bread and wine, and that humble music, decor, and ceremonial is more appropriate than something elaborate and rich, the response would be that this is never the way the Church has acted, whenever she has been free to express her innermost nature. Her liturgy in the first centuries had of necessity to be relatively simple, since Christians were a bitterly persecuted minority who had to meet in secret without shrines or temples of their own. After the legalization of Christianity by Emperor Constantine, the liturgy moved out of the homes and catacombs into great basilicas, and all of its latent doxological energies were released. The basis of the Christian cult, the Word made flesh, the splendor of the Eternal Father erupting into our world of sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, furnished the best, indeed irresistible and illimitable reason for incarnational worship, for outward and upward expansion in regard to its publicity, formality, solemnity, and glory. Thus, the Council of Trent declares, quote, "Since we must confess that no other work can be performed by the faithful that is so holy and divine as this awe-inspiring mystery, wherein that life-giving victim by which we are reconciled to the Father is daily immolated on the altar by priests, it is also sufficiently clear that all effort and attention must be directed to the end that it be performed with the greatest possible interior cleanness and purity of heart and exterior evidence of devotion and piety." Unquote. Pope John Paul II makes explicit what Trent implies. Quote, "Like the woman who anointed Jesus in Bethany, the Church has feared no extravagance, devoting the best of her resources to expressing her wonder and adoration before the unsurpassable gift of the Eucharist. With this heightened sense of mystery, we understand how the faith of the Church in the mystery of the Eucharist has found historical expression not only in the demand for an interior disposition of devotion, but also in outward forms meant to evoke and emphasize the grandeur of the event being celebrated." Unquote. That's from John Paul II's last encyclical, Ecclesia de Eucharistia. According to St. Pius X, music that has the first two qualities, holiness and artistic soundness, will necessarily have a third quality, universality. It will in some way be accessible to all believers and recognizable as appropriate for the liturgy. This is the trickiest quality of the three, because some cultures are so primitive or uneducated. I'm not trying to be politically incorrect here, but this is just a fact, right? Some cultures are so primitive or uneducated that initially they may not have ears to appreciate the sanctity and beauty of a certain type of music that other Catholics already take for granted as sacred. On the other hand, Benedict XVI posits that the great music of the Western tradition has a universal power to move souls. He is therefore also of the opinion that the greatest sacred music has an inherent power to speak to God-thirsting souls and to convert them to Christ. Certainly, we can see in the historical records that Gregorian chant and polyphony were welcomed and taken up by the peoples to whom European missionaries preached. You can find examples of this in Africa, in Asia, in the New World, in Central and South America. And we have amazing examples of enculturated but recognizably Catholic music from the missions, a blend of the European aesthetic with native colors and accents. A test for whether or not a style of music proposed for worship is truly universal is to ask whether imposing it on a foreign country or people would be a kind of imperialism. With Gregorian chant, the answer is in the negative, because, like Latin, chant belongs to no single nation, people, period, or movement. Nobody owns it. It's free. It's public domain. It developed slowly from ancient times to more recent centuries across the entire map where Christianity was planted. Its composers are predominantly anonymous, no royalty payments. It is the native musical clothing of the Latin Rite family of liturgies, something, by the way, that cannot be said of polyphony, as praiseworthy as it is. In short, wherever the Latin liturgy traveled throughout the world, there too Gregorian chant traveled, and it has never been perceived as anything other than the voice of the Church at prayer. To this day, many Africans sing and love to sing the Gregorian chant that was taught to their ancestors by the missionaries, a fact to which Cardinal Sarah has borne eloquent testimony on more than one occasion. In contrast, the style of praise and worship songs is obviously contemporary, American, and secular. If missionaries were to impose these songs on some indigenous tribe elsewhere in the world, it would be comparable to asking them to dress, eat, and talk like Americans. It is, in that sense, comparable to blue jeans, Coca-Cola, and iPhones. But what about emotions? A student once objected to me that St. Augustine considers affection of the heart so essential a component of prayer that if one's heart is not stirred, one is not truly praying, even if one has the right thoughts and the right intention. Out of this patristic axiom, my interlocutor extrapolated the conclusion that emotionally rousing music, such as one finds in praise and worship, is helpful for animating prayer, perhaps even necessary for some people or in some circumstances. Not so fast. We cannot assume that our conception of emotional engagement is what Augustine meant by affection of the heart. Given that he famously objected to what he considered to be the sensuality of Ambrosian liturgical chant, which would doubtless not seem especially emotional by today's standards, it is in fact far more likely that Augustine would have strongly disapproved of contemporary Christian music. In the Confessions, we see him struggling with whether or not music should have any role in the liturgy, because of the danger that it may draw too much attention to itself or to its performer. He finally concludes that it can and should have a role, but only if it is restrained. A beautiful singing of a psalm might lead to tears, but these are the tears of the spiritually sensitive. Augustine's affection of the heart is a gentle movement of the heart towards the divine and away from reliance on the senses and the appetites of the flesh. The words of a modern Byzantine commentator about icons apply just as well to music for church, which ought to have an iconic function. He writes, "Icons lift our soul from the material to the spiritual realm, from a lower level of being, thought, and feeling to a higher level." We have to be extremely careful how we understand the role of emotions in worship. Unless we are sleeping or totally distracted, our emotions will inevitably be engaged in some way at some level. It is not really a question of emotionlessness versus emotionalism, but a question of whether the emotional state we are in is a state of self-contained boredom, an excitation and agitation of feeling, or the quiet intensity of looking and listening for the truth above and beyond oneself. The first and the second, the boredom and the agitation, differ in the degree of activity, but they do not differ in regard to whether there has been a genuine transcendence of oneself and one's worldly frame of reference. I think this is maybe the more essential point. A culture predisposed to think everyone should be on a high as often as possible via athletics, drugs, sex, or rock concerts will likewise incline people to think that prayer and the worship of God ought to be the same way. One should feel on a high. Sacred music, however, has never aimed at such an emotional high. In fact, it has conscientiously avoided it to guard against the danger of fallen man becoming submerged in and thus limited by his feelings. Feelings make good servants, but bad masters. As Dom Gregory Hugel observes, divine providence has arranged that liturgical music should be austere and unyielding to personal whims. The sentiments of profound reverence mingled with fear and love break the snares which Satan has laid. Sacred music gently moves man's emotions in order to foster the intellectual activities of meditation and contemplation. This approach corresponds to the timeless advice of the spiritual masters who, while recognizing that emotion has a legitimate value, are cautious about deliberately stoking it or tapping into it for religious purposes. Emotion is more likely to have a clouding or distracting effect than a clarifying or concentrating one. Instead of facilitating the ascent of the mind to God, it can lead to an illusion of self-transcendence that is evanescent and disappointing. The much-loved spiritual author, Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, opines, outside feelings of surprise, a person should not allow himself to be carried away with his feelings, because God should remain the master and center of our attention. Brother Lawrence goes on to warn, quote, Those who conduct themselves in the spiritual life only by following their particular dispositions and feelings, who believe that they have nothing more important to do than to examine whether they are full of devotion or not, this sort of person could not possibly be stable or certain in his conduct, because these things change continually, whether by our own negligence or by the order of God, who varies his gifts and his conduct towards us according to our needs." Unquote. An expert on Carmelite mysticism, Father Thomas Dubé, writes, quote, "Holiness does not consist in delights at prayer. When God does not give the feelings of devotion even to generous people, they should not be in the least upset, but should rather merely conclude that this emotional dimension is not presently necessary." Unquote. It takes a lot of maturity, though, I think, to get to that point, but that's the truth. To summarize our critique, praise and worship music is not suitable for liturgical use. Its style reinforces a false conception of the Church's liturgy as communal gatherings in which subjective feelings, informality, and spontaneity play a large role. In reality, as Romano Guardini and Joseph Ratzinger show, divine liturgy is characterized by objectivity, formality, and unspontaneity, and only because it has those qualities can it have the power to be for all of us the fixed principle of our thoughts and actions, the rock on which we can build our interior life, the infinitely pleasing worship that is offered not so much by us as by our high priest and by us in union with him. The Mass in particular must not be so weighed down with sentimentality and subjectivity that its essence is clouded by its accidents and we lose sight of what it actually is: the mystical representation of Christ's supreme sacrifice on the cross. We know this truth only by faith-informed intellects and never by a psychosomatic faculty, whether it be the external senses, the imagination, or the emotions. We participate in this objective public solemn offering primarily by uniting our mind and will to the prayers of the priest and the realities they point to. At the same time, the externals of the liturgy should lead our minds and hearts in the direction of this faith-perceived mystery, so that what we sense and what we believe do not seem to be at odds, but rather converge in harmony. The sensible elements of the liturgy are meant to evoke and gesture towards the imperceptible mystery, inviting us to make acts of adoration, contrition, supplication, and thanksgiving in the presence of our Lord's redeeming sacrifice, and to participate in it most intimately by receiving Holy Communion. All of this is something that totally transcends the emotional realm as such. And while it is true that the Lord sometimes grants strong emotions to individuals as an encouragement or prompting or consolation, we relate to the essence of what is taking place through our intellect and will, properly cleansed, focused, and directed. Moreover, there cannot be a place for contemporary pop-inspired or pop-influenced music in the liturgy because it violates several of the principles repeatedly given in authoritative church documents. The fact that many priests and bishops do not enforce these rules and do not seem to care, as Father Ashley was mentioning, is beside the point, just as the fact that most Catholics dissent from humanae vitae, including many members of the clergy, does not justify contraception. Many Catholics are in a state of colossal ignorance, habitual carelessness, and sometimes outright disobedience, and we must plainly admit that the current crisis of identity, doctrine, and discipline in the Church is an unsurprising result. I would go further and say we need to be moving away from the fashion or fad of using music derived from contemporary popular styles at any liturgical or devotional activity. We would do well in Eucharistic adoration, for example, to allow silence to predominate, and at judicious moments to make use of simpler chants. There's nothing worse, in my opinion, than a holy hour that's just completely filled with music and noise. I mean, that sort of defeats the purpose of the adoration. Silent prayer combined with chant allows people of very different temperaments, personalities, ages, and situations they may be going through in life to be united in prayer in a way that can be adapted to the needs of each. A more stirring form of music, while it may have a place in Christian recreational sittings like the campfire, does not facilitate group prayer, a fortiori liturgical prayer, in the way that silence, chant, and polyphony do. At this point, we need briefly to consider a commonly made objection. Isn't the church's traditional music too hard, too difficult for people nowadays? They need easier stuff to sing. When my son, who was no prodigy, was 5 years old, he could sing the 4 major Marian antiphons, Salve Regina, and so on. By the time he was 6, he could sing the Missa Orbis Factor, the Missa De Angelis, and other chants familiar in our church without being able to read the music, and not because we instructed him. My daughter was the same way. Other boys and girls in the community were no different. Since children are gifted learners by ear, and many chants have captivating melodies, the children in the community quickly pick up these chants if they live in communities that prize them. It was just by osmosis that all of that happened, not by any kind of instruction. That is how tradition was and is always passed down, naturally, painlessly, orally, through a common treasuring of traditional things and a common use of them. In the heyday of the burgeoning Gregorian chant revival before Vatican II, Justine Ward, who was mentioned just earlier, so we're hitting on all these points, Justine Ward had developed an incremental method by which schools across the world were successfully teaching chant to thousands of children. There were public liturgies at which crowds of boys and girls would beautifully chant the ordinary of the Mass. Let me give you an example. At the principal Mass of the Eucharistic Congress in Chicago in 1926, a choir of 62,000 children, drawn from hundreds of parochial schools in Chicago and its environs, came together to chant the Mass in unison. Such endeavors could easily have kept growing and continued well into our times, propelled by Vatican II's encomium of chant. But the 1960s and 1970s were not a propitious time for the preservation of tradition, to put it as an understatement. Those in charge of institutions gambled on the supposed evangelistic benefits of modernization and let go of precious cultural treasures, even when sociologists of religion were predicting a renewal of interest in tradition among those searching for meaning in an increasingly chaotic post-Christian West, and were expressing doubts about the staying power of shallow contemporary substitutes for perennial practices. If we look east to the Byzantine sphere, we can still find congregations really all over the place, accustomed to singing liturgical texts in 3 or 4 harmonized parts. This is common throughout the Eastern Christian world. Western Christians quickly pick it up, as I experienced firsthand at the International Theological Institute in Austria and at Wyoming Catholic College. Both of those places had a lot of Byzantine liturgy going on. Truly, the capacity of the human soul for great music is limitless. We should not underestimate either the capacity or the need for excellence in this domain. No one should ever assume that young people today cannot become cultured or acquire a wide intellectual purview, as if being primitive or illiterate is an unavoidable condition of modern youth. It is a social and cultural choice we have made in creating the artificial post-World War II category of the teenager. In reality, as Romano Guardini asserts, quote, a fairly high degree of genuine learning and culture is necessary in the long run in order to keep spiritual life healthy. By means of these two things, learning and culture, spiritual life retains its energy, clearness, and catholicity. Culture preserves spiritual life from the unhealthy, eccentric, and one-sided elements with which it tends to get involved only too easily. The Church desires, as a rule, that spiritual life should be impregnated with the wholesome salt of genuine and lofty culture. Unquote. The Church has an obligation to immerse her children in her own heritage from birth onwards. As the Swiss psychiatrist Jean Piaget demonstrated, the early years of a child are the cultural womb that completes the process of gestation. All Catholic children should be singing the Salve Regina and the Gloria by the age of 5 or 6. A failure to give this heritage of beauty and spiritual strength to the little ones, so loved by our Lord, is a kind of high treason against the supernatural polity of the people of God. We must not underestimate the capacity of young people and of the laity in general to enjoy, appreciate, participate in, and grow spiritually from the traditions of the Catholic Church. A true spiritual hunger exists in the world. It is not only growing, but also, unfortunately, assuming deviant forms because it does not find satisfaction in much of what is being offered in the name of relevance and enculturation. I will bring my talk now to a conclusion. In the 60s and 70s, it was often said that the church had to reconfigure herself from top to bottom because modern man needs something different from his forebears. And today, alas, the same message is repeated ad nauseam. But modern man is not essentially different from the man of any age. His spiritual needs are fundamentally the same as they have always been. What people today need is not something new, changing, ephemeral, fashionable, but something timeless and perennial, connecting them across the ages with their ancestors and uniting them to the Lord in adoration. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye on the ways, and see and ask for the old paths, which is the good way, and walk ye in it, and you shall find refreshment for your souls. Jeremiah 6:16. The life of prayer and worship that sustained centuries of faith, the glorious army of confessors, virgins, martyrs, holy laity, will sustain us, too, better than any modern innovations. On a certain occasion, when Pope Benedict XVI was speaking about the great Byzantine poet and composer Romanus the Melodist, he explained that the work of such artists, quote, reminds us of the entire treasure of Christian culture, born of faith, born of the heart that has found Christ, the Son of God. From this contact of the heart with the truth that is love, culture is born, the entire great Christian culture. And if the faith continues to live, this cultural inheritance will not die, but rather it will continue to live and be current. Icons continue to speak to the hearts of believers to this day. They are not things of the past. The cathedrals are not medieval monuments. Rather, they are houses of life where we feel at home, where we find God and each other. Neither is great music, Gregorian chant, Bach, or Mozart something of the past. Rather, it lives in the vitality of the liturgy and of our faith. If faith is alive, Christian culture will never be outdated, but rather will remain alive and current. Unquote. Thanks to the profound teaching and compelling example of Pope Benedict XVI, which also remain alive and current in spite of successive assaults against them, we have entered a new era of rediscovering a lost heritage and rejoicing in its wondrous beauty. The Church of the future will have a growing number of people who ask for and deserve to receive the treasures of tradition that the Catholic Church, and she alone, can offer them. Thank you for your kind attention.